Federal investigators just exposed what they're calling the money trail behind Antifa, and it leads straight to George Soros.
President Trump's going after top Democrat donor George Soros and his son Alexander for allegedly supporting, quote, violent protests. What does the president want?
The left's dark money network features George Soros and his Open Society Foundation.
In a joint operation spanning 3 federal agencies, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Treasury, say they've uncovered a network of tax-exempt nonprofits and dark money foundations allegedly tied to violent protests across the United States. They're calling it a financial ecosystem of unrest, one that's been quietly funded through shell grants and overseas transfers. And at the center of that web, Soros's Open Society Foundations, now under federal review after new reports claim more than $80 million was funneled into activist groups accused of coordinating riots, sabotage, and domestic terrorism. Antifa. The investigation has already triggered RICO discussions inside the Justice Department. The same racketeering laws once used against the mob. And leading the crackdown is FBI Director Kash Patel, who told the National Desk,
"The one thing I've done my entire career under investigations, follow the money. Serve legal process and follow the money." Antifa, specifically speaking, as an example, we have to recognize these groups for what they are. It's not individual acts of violence. It is organized anarchy and chaos.
And it's coming straight from the top, from Trump himself.
George Soros and his wonderful radical left son should be charged with RICO because of their support of violent protests and much more, all throughout the United States of America.
Now agents are tracing that trail, from Washington to Atlanta, from Chicago to the West Bank, revealing encrypted transfers, hidden donors, and NGO networks that investigators say have turned protest into profit. For years, politicians called it speculation. Tonight, federal indictments are calling it organized financing of extremism. This isn't about marches anymore. This is a global funding war, and the feds just went public. When President Trump signed the September 2025 executive order naming Antifa a major terrorist organization, Washington made a series of moves in secret, unlocking the government's most powerful investigative weapon, financial tracing.
Speaking to matters like Antifa, for example, right? And the new EO that the president signed and their designations giving us authorities that we never had.
The order activated a coalition of agencies, the FBI, IRS, Treasury, and Department of Homeland Security, a task force built to track every dollar that crossed protest lines. Inside the Bureau, the operation got a code name only a few have seen on paper, Project Ledger.
And thanks to the president's initiatives, and when I was there in the Oval Office when he signed it, we are getting after the fight with more resources and tools that we've ever had. How is that acceptable? And it's all being caused. It's not individual acts of violence. It is organized anarchy and chaos.
Patel gave the Bureau's marching orders. Agents began combing through thousands of IRS 990 forms, encrypted transfers, and charity filings. The pattern that emerged looked less like scattered activism and more like logistics.
It is an organized effort that someone or some groups are paying for. And what I can tell the American people is we have open investigations on multiple groups and individuals funding these efforts.
And they're not working alone on this. Researchers at the Government Accountability Institute, Peter Schweizer and Seamus Bruner, were the first civilians to flag it. Their reports, handed directly to the White House, mapped dozens of organizations connected through shared donors, overlapping boards, and identical grant descriptions. According to GAI's briefings, the same foundations funding campus bail funds were also wiring money to protest logistics groups in 3 states. Some of that money, they allege, traced back to Soros's Open Society. But it's not just him.
It's other funding networks, the Arabella funding network, the Tides funding network, Neville Roy Singham and his network, Foreign Cash. And it's also big left-wing funders. Some of them are not citizens of this country. Mr. Hans-Jörg Wyss of Switzerland. They're pouring money into this entire ecosystem.
Each connection raises the same question. Is this really what activism looks like? Or is it organized financing? By late October, federal subpoenas were already landing on nonprofit desks. Patel's agents weren't just collecting tax records, they were digging into encrypted payment processors, foreign transfers, and charitable endowments that, according to investigators, don't add up. Inside those files lay the first proof that this was infrastructure, and the trail was about to lead them into something far bigger than anyone expected. As investigators traced the first financial wires, a new phrase started coming up in Washington briefing rooms, two words that would redefine the protest economy: Riot Incorporated.
We have identified dozens of radical organizations, not just the decentralized Antifa organizations, but dozens of radical organizations that have received more than $100 million.
According to Bruner's data, this was a carefully curated business model, a professional hierarchy with divisions for logistics, media, and legal protection. The frontline activists, the ones harassing the government, are simply the visible tip of a corporate pyramid. Behind the slogans and violence was a wild amount of financial data, spreadsheets, IRS 990s showing overlapping donors, the Tides Foundation, the Arabella Network, and Open Society foundations appearing again and again. Grants labeled Direct Action Support, Mutual Aid Infrastructure, and Rapid Response Funds. In Portland, funds allegedly moved through a homeless outreach nonprofit that doubled as a supply hub during the 2020 riots. In Seattle, a bail fund received matching donations from 3 separate community alliances, all linked by the same fiscal sponsor. Each thread led back to the same donor networks the GAI had flagged years earlier. Federal agents began to notice the same phrasing in grant paperwork: nonviolent direct action, community defense, street support, code words that investigators say often mask operational spending. One official described it as a shadow payroll, and while many of these groups publicly denounce violence, internal documents obtained by GAI and the Capital Research Center reportedly show that's just what they want the average American to think. In reality, there was coordination across multiple cities: Portland, Seattle, Chicago, involving paid participants and organized transport. What they tried to make look like flash mobs springing up with no rhyme or reason has failed. Now, the government sees it as the organized franchise it is.
These groups just don't show up overnight. You don't have hundreds of people surround a courthouse overnight and then move down to LA and cause riots and then move halfway across the country and cause disruptions in Chicago and elsewhere.
By the time those findings reached the FBI's domestic terror desk, the term Riot Inc. had moved from commentary to a sealed case file. And if Bruner's numbers were even half right, the next phase would uncover the most explosive connection yet: an $80 million network tied directly to Soros's global foundation.
The last few weeks have featured revelation after revelation of how our tax dollars have been spent propping up radical left-wing causes across the world.
2 weeks into the federal probe, the money trail hit a name every investigator recognized: the Open Society Foundations, and a report that changed everything. Compiled by researcher Ryan Morrow for the Capital Research Center, the 140-page document traced more than $80 million in grants from Soros's foundation to organizations accused of aiding extremist activity between 2016 and 2025. Among the recipients were the Movement for Black Lives, the Sunrise Movement, which endorsed the Antifa-linked Stop Cop City campaign in Atlanta, and the Center for Third World Organizing, which partnered with the militant Ruckus Society to train activists in property destruction and sabotage. According to the CRC, this was more than philanthropy gone wrong. It was a systemic pattern of financing, what the FBI classifies as domestic extremism. Ryan Morrow: Open Society's philanthropy blurs into complicity, fueling groups that celebrate violent uprisings, train militants, and endorse terrorist movements. The CRC report didn't stop at U.S. borders. It detailed an additional $59 million funneled overseas, including $2.3 million to Al-Haq, a West Bank NGO later sanctioned by the U.S. State Department for ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a designated terror organization. Another $975,000 went to Seven Amle, an Israel-based group accused of praising convicted terrorists and advising social platforms on content moderation, giving it both influence and cover. The revelation shook Washington. For the first time, Soros's network was exposed wide open, accused of not just ideological funding, but tied by paper trail to organizations sanctioned for terrorism. Still, investigators had to tread carefully. The CRC's findings were explosive, but not yet independently verified. Federal agents began cross-referencing those numbers with Treasury data, searching for transfers, endowments, or offshore routing that could substantiate the claims. Behind the scenes, Kash Patel's team was building what insiders called a financial RICO matrix, a database designed to match nonprofit money movement with protest incidents. $80 million, a figure that, if proven, could redefine what counts as domestic terrorism financing in the United States. And the deeper the Bureau dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just domestic. The trail was crossing borders. When investigators followed the money overseas, the story stopped being local. What began as a domestic terror funding probe was now crossing borders and brushing against America's allies and adversaries alike. When the Capital Research Center's report mentioned Al-Haq as one of the organizations Soros is funding, it made analysts pause. This is because the department has sanctioned Al-Haq for acting as a financial and logistical front for dark entities engaged in unlawful attacks on civilians. According to the CRC's data, between 2016 and 2023, the Open Society Foundations granted Al-Haq roughly $2.3 million, money intended for human rights litigation that federal investigators now list as potentially diverted. The other recipient also drew alarm from federal investigators. This is because watchdogs found staff overlaps with Al-Haq. There were some shared legal counsel, shared data servers, and even joint policy briefs. Intelligence later linked several of its board members to figures within the PFLP. For Washington, the pattern looked disturbingly familiar. Philanthropic funds crossing into politically volatile regions, then re-emerging in movements that challenge U.S. interests at home. Analysts at Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network began flagging transfers with identical routing codes, one leg terminating in foreign humanitarian accounts, the other surfacing in U.S. activist bail funds. If connected, that would mean international donors were indirectly bankrolling domestic unrest.
The left's dark money network has deep ties to USAID, which has rightly received renewed scrutiny under Doge and after Elon Musk shined a light on it. While the Open Society Foundations has stated that it does not receive funds from USAID or direct USAID's spending, the Soros-founded nonprofit has a long history with USAID. In 2001, the Soros Foundations Network, which became Open Society, listed USAID among its donor partners.
And that's not all. There are also a list of projects they've collaborated on together and what they did with those projects.
Open Society and USAID have jointly funded the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, a news outlet that attacked conservatives for, you guessed it, criticizing Soros.
Investigators also discovered that they are also funded through the same pipeline.
Open Society and USAID also jointly fund the East-West Management Institute.
Once they had that information, Patel's team briefed cabinet-level officials on the international component, and even men who had heard many things over their years of service were shocked at the far reach of Soros's network. It was now bigger than RICO. If proven, it could qualify as cross-border terror financing, a charge that carries the same weight as material support for foreign militants. But before the Justice Department could act, another piece of the puzzle surfaced, not from overseas, but from within the Bureau itself. By late autumn, the investigation had outgrown the think tank reports. It was now a full federal case file, and for the first time, the Bureau was naming targets.
We have legal process that has already been executed. The search warrant results are coming in. If we as a society just allow these riots to continue, then we as a society are going to be engulfed by the criminal activity these people are doing.
Patel's team, operating under Trump's September 22nd executive order, had merged data from the IRS, the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and Europol's Cyber Finance Unit. Together, they built a matrix linking protest logistics, donor shells, and international transfers. Each connection triggered a new subpoena, and by October's end, more than 40 search warrants were in motion, seizing hard drives, encrypted phones, and internal grant ledgers from half a dozen nonprofits headquartered between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. The Bureau's analysts began uncovering what they described as parallel accounting systems, separate ledgers for tax filings, and operational budgets. One senior agent likened it to organized crime bookkeeping. You've got a charity column and a street column. Inside the trove, receipts referencing direct action logistics, cash transfers marked mutual aid rapid support, and communication logs with bail fund intermediaries later tied to Antifa-associated protests. Ted Cruz, I want to encourage the Bureau to go after anyone who aided and abetted these riots. Add rioting to RICO and follow the money. Cruz's Stop Funding Rioters Act gave Patel new legal ground. the ability to expand RICO predicates to include organized civil unrest. Within weeks, federal prosecutors in Georgia and Illinois opened joint task force desks dedicated solely to Antifa-linked financing. Federal agents tracked matching wire patterns between protest weekends, and what they found was shocking. The same donor entities would spike transactions on Thursday, then vanish by Monday, a rhythm investigators called event-based funding. Those files, now sealed under federal court order, form the backbone of what insiders quietly call the Soros dossier, a compilation of financial evidence, interviews, and encrypted communications said to link major foundations to domestic unrest. Whether that dossier results in indictments remains to be seen, but for the agents working inside the Bureau's windowless rooms, one thing is certain: the investigation has already redrawn the battlefield. This is now about networks, influence, and control. Tonight, the money trail is out in the open. From local protests to foreign NGOs, investigators say the lines are drawn, and they all point to one global funding web under federal review. If you want the next drop, the leaks, the indictments, the evidence the networks don't want you to see, go ahead and subscribe, because this story isn't over. It's just getting started.